Hi, everybody. I hope all's going well with you. Welcome back to week two of science class. See if you get this meme. Well, different species, speciation everywhere. So last week, the main point was how natural selection can take one species and evolve it into two new species. And the key idea of understanding that speciation, that's two species forming from one, is that you had to have some kind of a geographical barrier that splits a population in two. Um, and if you had that, a mountain range that develops, or a river, or a Grand Canyon, or continents pulling apart, as you know now, natural selection is going to happen um, on both sides of the population. Different mutations will happen on both sides, and whichever ones happen to work for the environment they're in will be selected for. And over time, you can get speciation, which is one species evolving into two. So this week, before we get into our new stuff, uh, the big part of this week is when you get through the fourth lesson, I guess, is really our unit test. There's 3 lessons in the unit test. And so, as I said last week, the unit test this time is going to be all open notes, which is incredible. It's an incredible opportunity, especially if you've struggled on some of these tests, to use your notes in a way that helps support your test taking skills. You'll actually be able to take the test multiple times if you want. So if you want to study for the test and then take it from your studying, and then take it again using your notes, and then take it again trying to correct the ones you missed, however you want to get there, that's great, because I'm considering the testing for the rest of the year on the online learning to be practice testing, getting you to develop your studying skills and test taking strategies, so that you can see, on some of those multiple choice questions, which is the better answer when you clearly have notes out and information in front of you. But anyway, as far as what's on the test, it goes from the beginning, and it's a good little refresher from what we've covered so far. You got to know the difference between a theory, scientific theory, versus a fact versus a hypothesis. You have those defined in your notes. And again, if you don't have any of this in the unit review materials, in the evolution folder on Schoology, you can watch the videos on all of this stuff to review. You can take your own notes from that. You can get the student notes I've posted on there, and use those however you feel most confident in going about that. Up to you. So the first topic, or one of the topics, is you got to understand all the evidence for evolution, right? Homologous structures, which are parts two different species have that they got from a common ancestor, as evidence for evolution. Vestigial organs, parts organisms have that don't work anymore, that must have changed over time, that's evidence for evolution. Of course, fossils of organisms we have that don't live here anymore, or evidence for change, or fossils that show how certain evidence or organisms have changed over time. And comparing DNA similarities between species, the more similar they are, suggests that they have a more recent evolutionary divergence, change from each other. And then remember pseudogenes. Pseudogenes are the non-functional genes organisms have inside of their DNA right now that don't work anymore, that used to have a function in the past. That's kind of like our vitamin C gene example. All those things help us see that evolution has happened. So you got to understand Lamarck's evolutionary hypothesis. He was the guy who thought that, if you use it or don't use it, you could pass those traits down to your offspring, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Natural selection, we've been spending time on the last couple of weeks. That's actually how evolution happens, from the best fit individuals with the best variations surviving and reproducing and passing that DNA on. Last week, you learned how you get two species from one by natural selection. And then overall, you got to understand the importance of genetic variation in speciation. You have to understand how DNA mutations can lead to an organism's new trait. So that means, the flow map of DNA to a trait. DNA is divided into genes. Genes have the information to make a protein, put amino acids together into a protein, and the protein leads to a trait. Well, if you mutate the DNA, that changes the information, ultimately changing the trait. And then today, this is our topic of, and today, and well, whenever you get this done this week, we're going to see some examples of natural selection going on in our world. So grab your science notebook, new topic, last topic of the unit here, put this at the top. The topic is, can we see examples of natural selection occurring in our world? The reason why we say natural selection instead of saying, can we see evolution occurring in our world, is because, as you now know, evolution of a new species takes hundreds of thousands to millions of years, as natural selection selects certain traits and causes them to slowly change. Well, humans not only have only been around 200,000 years, we've only understood the process of evolution for the last about 150 years. So there's never been a chance for us to observe one species evolving into something new because it takes too long. So the next best thing we can do to see that evolution is occurring on the planet is to look for examples of natural selection and happening in our world right now. So if you have this on your paper, the first example we're going to go through is the flu virus as an example of natural selection. As most of you guys know, and you get every year, you have to get a flu vaccine. And this is supposed to be a picture of the flu. Kind of looks like COVID as well. They're actually relative viruses, so they do look pretty similar. But this question here, why do we have to get a new flu shot every year? Well, if you think about it, the flu virus, in the big sense, if you get a flu shot, it protects your body from that virus from being able to reproduce inside of your body. And if the virus can't reproduce with the immunity that you've built up because of the shot, this guy will go extinct. But because every virus can have its own little genetic differences from mutation, there's a chance that one or two, or around the world, of these viruses might be able to reproduce in somebody. They might have the lucky mutation that allows them to survive. And what happens is they end up populating in one person, whereas most of the viruses get basically die off because they can't reproduce in anybody. But let's say this one right here has the lucky genetic mutation that even though you got this flu vaccine, it blocks most of the viruses. This guy has the lucky genetic mutation that allows it to still infect a human. So that infects a human, makes billions of the viruses. That human coughs onto the next human and passes it along. And as it gets passed from person to person around the world, eventually this flu shot that you got against, or that kills basically all of these other viruses here, but doesn't work against this one, the flu shot's no good anymore. So what that means is scientists have to look at the structure of this flu virus for the next year, make up a new flu shot, and give everybody that, so that by the time that this guy comes around and you get it, you might be protected. Now that's a pretty simplified example, explanation of how vaccines really work, but it does point out how natural selection is occurring on the virus. Any virus with a genetic mutation that helps it survive is going to be able to repopulate and be spread from person to person. And so we have to get new flu shots every year because natural selection is occurring with the viruses. Those that have the best traits survive. And so that's ongoing. Now you might be thinking in your head, well, why don't certain other viruses, like measles virus, you only get a vaccine against the measles virus one time in your whole life generally. And that's because certain viruses are much more stable and don't mutate as rapidly as the flu virus. The flu virus is one that mutates much more faster than your average virus. So it changes more, which means we have to keep updating the vaccine we give ourselves every year because the flu virus is mutating, whereas the measles virus doesn't mutate. The mumps virus, the chickenpox virus doesn't mutate rapidly. So if they gave you a flu shot, not a flu shot, but a measles vaccine when you're one, that measles that's around the world today is still basically the same. So you're still protected. So natural selection is working on the measles virus, but because there's not a lot of genetic variation in the measles virus population, we're winning that one as long as we keep getting vaccinated. I have heard too on the topic of the COVID virus that it is relatively stable, meaning it doesn't mutate quite as fast as the flu virus. So as scientists get this vaccine for the COVID coming in the next year or so, it probably will be relatively long lasting. Maybe, I have no idea, but it could be more than 1 year, but maybe 5 years, 10 years, maybe your whole lifetime. So that would be the good news on that. But anyway, so flu virus is an example of natural selection acting on the flu. Anyone that doesn't have the right mutations ends up not being able to reproduce and dying off, and only the ones with the right genetic survive. So number 2 on the list of examples of natural selection is pesticide resistant insects. So it kind of sounds like a mouthful at first, but if you think about it, pesticide is the chemicals that we spray on plants and stuff to kill the bugs, the insects, so they don't eat them. And so if you think of this picture here, it kind of shows, let's imagine a cornfield over several seasons of farming. And so according to the key here, most of the bugs, these little circles here are supposed to represent the bugs that are going to eat your corn as a farmer. Initially, they're susceptible, which means they can be killed by the pesticide the farmer is spraying with his plane onto the field. The red dots are the ones that are actually resistant. They don't die. Maybe they get a little sick, but they don't actually die. So imagine the first time a farmer sprays the pesticide onto its corn crops here, it's going to kill 95% of efficacy, means it works. 95% of them die off, which sounds incredible, and it's great, and it works really well, and that's true. That year, the farmer's corn crops are going to grow really well. There's going to hardly be any problem with bugs. But of course, you can think about what happens is these resistant ones survive, and they pass their resistant genes on. So the next season, when the farmer, and some of the yellow ones survive too, but the next season when the farmer repeats the process again, because there were some of those red guys that survived, they had more offspring and they became more common. So this year still, though, the crop probably still grows pretty well because the pesticide's working pretty well and killing most of them. But you can tell each season, as you keep using the same pesticides, you're killing off the weak yellow bugs, I guess, and you're allowing the resistant ones to reproduce and repopulate the cornfield. And you get to the point as a farmer where spraying the pesticide isn't going to do much good as far as helping your crop. You either need to get a new pesticide or change your technique somehow, because the insects have become resistant, meaning they don't die very easily. So this again is another example of natural selection, because the ones with the best traits are getting passed on each generation and they become more common. So we're causing the natural selection of the insects over time to make them resistant to the pesticides, which actually can be a very big problem for certain farmers in certain areas, because if they've used the pesticide a long time, they get into this situation or worse, where the pesticide maybe doesn't even work anymore. So that's another common example of natural selection going on in our world that we can see that affects our food supply, which is kind of important. And another example of why understanding evolution is important. And the last one that we're going to go into is antibiotic resistance. Now, I posted a video I want you to watch before you see the rest of this, just to kind of explains what antibiotic resistance is. So go back onto Schoology, pause this video here, note the time. Looks like 13 minutes, 22 seconds. Pause this video and go watch the video on antibiotic resistance on Schoology, just to give you some background, okay? I'll wait. Come back. All right, now I'm going to assume you've done that and you're back. So first of all, you got to know a few things on this topic. It's a little bit bigger than the other two. So write this down. What is an antibiotic? You probably saw from the video, but I'm going to put it in my words. An antibiotic is a drug that is given to kill a bacterial infection. Okay, so it's a specific drug that humans have made that will kill bacteria, which is great, because if you have a bacterial infection like strep throat or some other bacterial infection, we can take an antibiotic and it'll kill it. In fact, before we discovered these drugs, many people died every year from bacterial infections that are being saved today because we have these drugs. Okay. One thing to note is antibiotics only work on bacteria. They don't work on viruses at all. So you could take an example names are like penicillin and ampicillin, anything like that. If you took those and you had a cold or the flu or COVID-19, they won't work, because they're specifically drugs that kill bacteria, which it's great that we have those to kill bacteria. So drugs that kill bacteria. Antibiotic resistance, as you saw in the video, the idea is when the bacteria, because natural selection is happening on those, become resistant. They don't die as easily when somebody takes these drugs. again, think of it. If these bacteria are infecting your body and you take one of these antibiotics, say penicillin, who's the drug going to kill first? It's going to kill the weakest of the bacteria, whichever one can't resist penicillin at all. And after 10 days of taking it, if there's one or two that happen to have genetic mutations that allow them to be resistant to it, they didn't get it because you were taking the drug. They just have that genetic variability that allowed them to survive. Well, as soon as you're done, they're going to repopulate you, or maybe you coughed or spread it on to somebody else. They're going to regrow in that other person as a resistant bug. So that's antibiotic resistance, when bacteria become resistant to the drug that we're trying to use to kill them. And then again, how is this an example of natural selection? Well, I think it's probably obvious at that point, is we are the environmental agent that's causing the evolution of the bacteria. By taking the drugs, and people around the world are taking these antibiotics, we're killing off all the weak bacteria and allowing only the ones with genetic variations that allow them to survive. And so what we've done is we create a problem with ourselves and these bacteria, because we overuse these bugs so much. We've made so many bacteria that are resistant. Today, sometimes people go to the hospital and the doctor will give them an antibiotic to kill their bacterial infection, and it won't work because the bacteria are totally resistant to that. Luckily, we have lots of different kinds of antibiotics, so usually they can give you another antibiotic and you can take that, and that one probably will work. But so that's another example of natural selection happening in our world, and it's becoming more and more of a problem. Another connection to this that you might think of is the beginning of the year when we did our experiment where we had the plates and we put the different soaps and cleaners on little paper towels to see which one killed bacteria the best, and you got the zone of inhibition. These plates are trying to demonstrate, they're slightly different positions, but how certain bacteria are resistant. Each one of these paper towels is holding a different antibiotic. And if you look on plate 1 here, you got a nice zone around pretty much everyone here, meaning that the chemical kills the bacteria mess pretty well. But then here they're showing a bacteria that's resistant. It's a different species of bacteria from this first plate, and it's resistant to most of these antibiotics. These 3 right here, well, these 2 for sure, the antibiotic doesn't work anymore at all. That one looks like it works a tiny bit. This one is still working well. In fact, a lot of times when you get a bacterial infection, you go to the doctors, they'll swab your throat or something like this on a plate, just like we did. Put a bunch of these things down, let it grow for a day, and see, oh, look, this, let's say this is penicillin. This one still works really good, and then that'll be the antibiotic they give you to use to kill the bacteria. It's good information to know from a doctor's perspective, because they can determine which antibiotic they should be giving you to help cure whatever infection you happen to have. Okay, last thing, in the idea of natural selection examples, we had these 3, which you can find more. These aren't the only 3 at all. In fact, if you think about this question, it says, what data could be collected from another organism to demonstrate natural selection in action? You think, if I was to give you that as a research project, what data could you collect? The answer is pretty much you can collect data on any organism, any data, because all organisms are going through natural selection. It could be camouflage of the bunnies in your yard. It could be the aerodynamicness of different bird wings. It could be how long an ant can survive without water. All of that is how the natural selection would be acting on these organisms. All right. So that's it for this notes section, and that is the end of the unit as far as notes go. You have one other activity this week, and then you'll take the unit tests. So I wish you the best of luck on that, and I look forward to seeing all your scores.